This meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 90 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities. Pursuant to the order of reference of Tuesday, September 26th, 2023, the committee meets to resume with the consideration of clause by clause on Bill C-33, an act to amend the Customs Act, the Railway Safety Act, the Transportation of Dangerous Goods Act of 1992, the Marine Transportation Security Act, the Canada Transportation Act, and the Canada Marine Act, and to make a consequential amendment to another act. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. Pursuant to the standing orders, members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. To help us with clause-by-clause consideration of Bill C-33, I would now like to welcome back our witnesses. We have from the Canada Border Services Agency, Kathy Toxopius, Director General, Transformation, Planning and Projects. Welcome. What's that? Oh, just these ones? Have we moved it? Oh, geez, these ones? Okay. That's it?
Yes.
Okay, I wanted to get them on the same page. All right. Guess we don't. We have from the Department of Transport, Sonia Reed, Director General, Marine Policy. Heather Moriarty, Director of Ports Policy. Aidan Ryan, Director, Marine Security Operations. Rachel Heft, Manager and Senior Counsel, Transport and Infrastructure Legal Services, as well as Amy Kaufman, Counsel. And, of course, we have with us today our legislative clerks, Jean-François Paget and Philippe Millat, who I'd like to point out to our committee members celebrate 23 years in the House of Commons in service to Canadians today. Before we begin, I see your hand up, and I think you're going to be referencing the sound that we're hearing, correct? I'm going to turn it over to the clerk to see if we can rectify the situation because we're getting simultaneous translation on the speakers in the room that we are in.
I'm already asking for.
Okay. Did you want to? So colleagues, I apologize for this, but we're going to have to suspend for a couple of minutes until we rectify the situation. We'll suspend until we rectify the situation. I will turn the floor over now to Dr. Lewis to speak to CP4.
Cause by cause consideration of Bill C-33, I would like to take this moment to move a motion that was put on notice on Friday, November the 24th, and the motion is as follows. Given that after 7 years, the Canada Infrastructure Bank has A, made significant investment announcements and commitments that have either been canceled or failed, including the $1.7 billion Lake Erie Connector Project, the $20 million Mapleton Water and Wastewater Project, and 4 previously announced investments that have been canceled in 2022, 2023 alone. B, has made investment decisions that call into question its ability to make sound and responsible investments with taxpayer dollars in projects that benefit the public good, including most recently the multi-million-dollar deal for a private equity firm owner of a top luxury hotel. The committee recognized that it has lost confidence in the Canada Infrastructure Bank to make investment decisions that serve the best interests of Canadians and meet the urgent infrastructure needs of Canadian communities. Mr. Chair, I'm raising this motion at this moment because we know that at a time when carbon taxes are high, runaway deficit spending and inflation are forcing Canadians to attend food banks at rates that we've never seen before, that this government needs to be held accountable for the policies and how they are contributing to the pain Canadians are feeling. Future generations of Canadians are being saddled with billions of dollars of debt instead of being better off. They're being left with aging, deteriorating infrastructure. The Canada Infrastructure Bank has clearly failed to make sound investment decisions for the best interests of Canadians, and they have failed by issuing billions of dollar projects, including $655 million promised to a multi-billion-dollar company, Fortis, for an electricity project that ironically failed because of inflation projections caused by the Liberal government. This out-of-touch bank thought it was appropriate also during a housing crisis to lend $46.5 million to one of Canada's most expensive hotels so that they could retrofit their $500 a night rooms. This all in context of the bank that has had 7 years to get off the ground, but has failed to build infrastructure for communities, and that this infrastructure is extremely well needed now in order to fuel our economy. That is why I'm requesting the support of this committee to report this opinion to the House that makes clear that we have lost confidence in the ability of this bank to make investments in the best interests of Canadians at this critical time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lewis. Any questions, comments, colleagues? Yes, Mr. Strahl.
I do think that talking about the Canada Infrastructure Bank and its and our lack of confidence in it is important as we see that there are other transport-related files that are impacted by the Canada Infrastructure Bank. We're in the middle of a study that we'll get back to soon on high-frequency rail, which includes a huge role for the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And I think given their failure to operate at this time, Dr. Lewis listed several failures. We've talked previously about their spending more on administration than they are on infrastructure. We will continue to bring the case before the committee that we need to express our grave concern and lack of confidence in the Canada Infrastructure Bank until such time as the government takes notice. We've had our report that called for the Infrastructure Bank to be abolished. That was ignored. We will continue to point out the issues with the Infrastructure Bank because it has a real impact on Canada's ability to produce the infrastructure that it needs in a responsible manner. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. Seeing no other questions, comments, we will go to a vote. Madam Clerk.
Mr. Bedaway,
No.
Mr. Iacono, Madame Koutrakis,
No.
Ms. Murray.
No.
Mr. Rogers,
No.
Mr. Strahl,
Yes.
Dr. Lewis,
Yes.
Mr. Muse,
Yes.
Mr. Lewis,
Yes.
Monsieur Barcelou Duval,
Oui.
Yes.
6 yeas, 4 nays.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. The motion carries. We will now go back to CPC 4. And for that, I will turn the floor over to you, Mr. Strahl.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and it's good to be here with you all today. As you will recall, we were in the middle of a discussion about giving the board the power to giving the board the power to make appointments in the case where the minister has failed to make an appointment in a timely manner. And the discussion was whether or not 6 months was enough time, or if that amount should be extended to another period, such as 12 months. Obviously, I can't make that sort of amendment to my own amendment, but certainly I think the principle that I'm wanting to see included here is to compel the minister to make appointments in a timely way and to have a consequence which still allows the boards to operate, but to do so by making appointments only for those particular appointments that fall to the minister's authority. This wouldn't be for municipal appointments or other level of government appointments, but it specifically addresses just those that the minister makes. So if the ball is entirely in the minister's court and he or she failed to make that appointment in a timely fashion, I think it's good to have this backstop so that boards don't go with vacancies, which we've seen far too often in the last 8 years. So I'm willing to, if anyone else would be willing to amend that to a 12-month period, I think I would be very amenable to that.
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. Mr. Muse.
Yeah, so pursuant to that and following up on our conversation from late Wednesday evening, which there seemed to be a consensus developing around the 12-month mark, so I propose that as a sub-amendment, hopefully a friendly amendment.
Muse will go to discussion on sub-amendments, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Barcelou Duval. À vous la parole.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to mention that if Mr. Muse had not proposed to have the discussion that we had around the 6 months, which led to 12 months for an amendment, I would have done it formally. So you would understand from my comment that if I could propose such a sub-amendment, I would be in favor. I would certainly vote in favor of another amendment, which would postpone it to 12 rather than 6 months. I think 12 is a reasonable timeline. On the part of a government, it is unreasonable that within that period of time, they should not be able to fill those vacancies. We know the significance of infrastructure such as port infrastructure, and I'm comfortable with this decision. And in any case, I think the government, by having such rules in place, will do everything possible for those positions to be filled before 12 months. So I think they should not perceive this as a threat, but the fact that if there's only one position for which you can that is needed to be filled up, this enables, if you have to fill up all these positions, it enables the ports to be able to function optimally. Thank you, Mr. Duval. Over to Mr. Backrack.
I do find the idea to be a compelling one because, you know, I think it's a clever way to encourage the government to speed up its appointment process. Obviously, this is something that has been very challenging for port boards. And I think at our last meeting when we were discussing this, the officials who are with us were explaining some of the consultation process that the department undergoes when they're considering an appointment, partly in an effort to ensure that our port boards aren't old boys clubs or young boys clubs for that matter. And I think that's something that all of us around the table would support. I'm just wondering under this new proposal if the board itself, if the board were going to appoint people after this 1 year period, if they would also be required to undertake similar consultations, or whether they would be less encumbered and they could essentially appoint anyone they wanted to. That's essentially my question.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. I'll turn it over to Mr. Strahl for a response.
I think it is also important to note that these board appointments are for a specific term. And so what is happening here is that someone is coming to the government is aware, the minister's aware that an appointment is, a term is coming to its end. So they should be actually preparing well in advance of someone's term ending to prepare a list of possible replacements and new board members. So it's not like the clock starts the moment there's a vacancy. The clock actually should be starting if the planning is being done well ahead of time, so that the work can be done to find someone. In British Columbia we have key former labor representatives on the board. It's at the Port of Vancouver, etc. This work can be done in advance. So this is essentially saying once the vacancy occurs, that's when the time starts for the 1 year vacancy clock, if we can call it that. But the work that Mr. Bachrach refers to and that Ms. Murray referred to in the previous meeting can begin well before an appointment, a term expires. So I think this is simply saying, do your work ahead of time, get it done in a year. That's reasonable. And if you don't, the board, it's not suddenly, there's not a hostile process. The board then just is able to choose from nominees to make those appointments. So there really is no excuse for this ever to be used, but right now the vacancies are just extending out way too long. That's what this is attempting to do.
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. Mr. Bachrach.
Along the same lines as my last question, there are certain seats that are appointed by the minister that are have specific criteria around them. For instance, the minister appoints a number of seats in consultation with the users of the port. And should this bill pass, one of those seats is going to be allocated to a director in consultation with labor groups at the port. And so my concern is that if that is one of the directors, if one of the directors' seats is vacant for more than a year, and they fall into that category where they have to be appointed in consultation with either the users, the terminals, or what have you at the port, or the labor groups, it's unclear whether the members of the board who are doing this self-appointment would be similarly required to consult those groups and ensure that that seat is filled by someone who comes from those groups. It doesn't speak to whether that would be the case.
Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Strahl.
Perhaps I could get the legislative clerk or someone to confirm that it specifically says the board of directors of a port authority may appoint a director under paragraph sub 1A or D. So perhaps could just reference which positions that would refer to. Well, yourself, or it doesn't. Sure. I don't care who.
I'll turn it over to any member of our witnesses to respond to that. Ms. Reid.
So under 14.1A, those are the governor and council appointees, one individual nominated by the minister. Sub 14.1D is in relation to the individuals nominated by the minister in consultation with user groups. That includes, pursuant to the amendments that were adopted previously by committee, that would include the labor groups.
So the question through you, Mr. Chair, to Ms. Reid is the current amendment and sub-amendment that we're debating right now, would it be clear that those positions that are left vacant for more than a year are to be filled under the requirements of those two subparagraphs that you mentioned? Or do we need additional language to make that clear?
Ms. Reed?
I think based on our understanding of the amendment, that it's not clear because the Board of Directors isn't actually appointing them under 14.1D. They have to appoint them under the new provision, and the new provision does not include language that says it has to be done in consultation with the user groups. So I'm not clear from a policy perspective that would be the case.
Thank you, Ms. Reed. Back to Mr. Bachrach.
I think if I understood Mr. Strahl correctly, he would be open to an additional sub-amendment that would clarify that. And I just wonder maybe if we should recess briefly to give a chance to consult with the legislative clerk and come up with some wording. I think I could be convinced of this as long as we protect that aspect of the appointments.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. I'll turn it over to Mr. Strahl.
And again, I'm not legislative clerk, but it would be the reason that we specifically selected those 1A and D positions, which has now been amended, was that all of the rules apply except for who's doing the appointing at this point. That would be the intention, is that that everything, the 1A and D would remain intact. And if D has been amended to include user groups, which now include specific labor consultation, then the expectation would be that would be maintained, but open again to either standing this, coming back to it, or happy to suspend if we believe that we can wrestle this to the ground in a few minutes.
Mr. Bachrach, suspend for 2 minutes, see if we can figure this out. Okay, we'll suspend for, we'll go 5 minutes to sort this out. This meeting is suspended. order. I'll turn the floor over to Mr. Bachrach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the attempt here is to come to some sort of consensus, or at least as close to a consensus as we can get, understanding that the goal of this amendment is to deal with one of the challenges that we've heard from the ports and from port users, which is that there's these long delays in appointing board members. And I think the key here is that we ensure that the consultation process that leads to board appointments remains intact, even when under this amendment, the boards would be appointing their own directors. And so, I think there are different ideas around how to do that. Ms. Murray was just pointing out to me that the government, in addition to the consultations that are required by the legislation, the government conducts additional screens on the consultation process to ensure that that the boards of port authorities are becoming more diverse and that we're reflecting the makeup of our country. And so I think that's important to consider as well, in addition to the specific consultations with labor groups or with port users, that there's another layer. And so if there's a way to build that into the sub-amendment, I think that would be worthwhile. But I understand that there's some desire to let this one sit with the Legislative Council for a bit and move on to the next amendment, and I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. I'll turn it over to Mr. Badaway, followed by Mr. Strahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a few comments. The government has a transparent process, as has been alluded to already by Mr. Bachrach, that ensures proper consultation with user groups and vetting of candidates based on the makeup of each and every board that we actually are a part of, this one in particular. We recognize that issues that have been raised by the witnesses here at committee when it comes to filling board vacancies on a faster timeline. I think that goes without saying. We've seen that with many boards and agencies throughout the years. But the solution to this shouldn't mean that the board should automatically be able to appoint a candidate. Appointments take a long process, some time, because they're subject to consultations, strict checks and balances, background checks, conflicts of interest, security, and this amendment seems to circumvent some of that. I guess to some extent I understand, however, because I've even found myself in the same position with some of the boards and agencies that I deal with almost on a daily basis, of the need to expedite and be timely on appointments. And I think we're hearing from our witnesses that 6 months is a bit too tight of a timeline, considering the steps that we are required to complete an appointment or any given appointment. And we would like to see this extended to 1 year, which we think is a more reasonable time frame. Let's all remember that the boards of directors is composed of different types of representatives, including user class and nominees from various levels of government, federal, provincial, as well as the municipal level of government. If we are or were to move forward or move this forward, this amendment forward or sub-amendment, I think it's important that we keep the scope to user class, directors only. That way, we wouldn't be putting limits on nominees from any level of government, which is important for representation on the board and for, obviously, all Canadians. For this class of seats, consultations with user groups are required of the minister, and I think that's a fair thing we'd want to see the board do before making any decision. Another thing to consider is that we need to make sure that there's adequate notice if this is going to happen. For example, say that a federal nomination is very close to being confirmed, but takes a few days past the timeline we set with this particular amendment. Is the board's decision going to be automatic 6 months and 1 day into the vacancy? I think this would also help to incentivize the minister to expedite the process, obviously. And if he knows or she knows that the board is going to look to appoint someone imminently, this could be the push that's needed to get the regular appointment process over the line. And I think, quite frankly, Mr. Chairman, that's the intent by Mr. Strahl in bringing this forward. The last thing I'll state before I do present a sub-amendment proposal is lastly, for any appointments that happen via the process, let's make sure the same perimeters around security requirements and removal for cause are in place. This should be consistent for any member of the board, regardless of how they're appointed. We'd like to propose then, therefore, Mr. Chair, a sub-amendment to make sure all this is included. And I'm hoping that the clerk take note of it because it does get very granular.
Before you do that, Mr. Badaway, I just wanted to point out, we already have a sub-amendment on the table by Mr. Muse, so we can't put forward another sub-amendment on this. What else? The two options we have are either voting on the sub-amendment that was proposed by Mr. Muse, or Mr. Muse, you can withdraw it. Go ahead, Mr. Straw.
So
by all
I
means.
realize we're might be out of order here, but I think it sounds like there's a good faith effort to get to the same place. And so perhaps we can stand this and I'm not sure that this should now that there's a government amendment, Mr. Bachrach should be the one collecting all of that, but perhaps we can get it to Legislative Council. Everyone can submit their, I think ours includes a 12-month going from 6 to 12. Dan's does. Mr. Badaway's read that was part of it. There's some other things that we clearly want to have in it, but we can't sub-amend all the way through. So I take everyone at their word that we're looking for the same thing. So maybe we do stand this and work kind of behind the scenes to get something we can all agree on.
The other option that we have, thank you, Mr. Strahl, is that everybody sends what they have to the legislative clerk. There's no middle person. There's no plead exactly. And then the legislative clerk will give us all the ideas back. Summarize. Council, excuse me. Doesn't want to give himself work. 23 years in, doesn't want any more work. Legislative Council. Does that work for everybody? Okay, so we'll have a vote now to stand this. Is that it? Yeah? Okay. Yeah. So we'll stand CPC 4. Sorry. You need to stand the whole clause. Oh, the whole clause. All right, we're going to stand 102 until we get the advice back from Legislative Council. That work for everybody? Yeah. Okay. We will now move on to, we're going to go to clause 3, to block 4. Yep. Oh, 103. Okay, we'll go to 103. Shall clause 103 carry? Division? Yeah, no need for a recorded vote. You guys called for recorded votes before. It's up to you.
I'm saying on division now.
On division? On
Everyone
division?
ready for that?
Okay, we're good. So clause 103 carries on division. Shall clause 104 carry? Yes, Mr. Strahl?
So we would like to see clause 104 deleted, or we vote against it, I guess, is how we accomplish that. Clause 104 essentially creates a new clause that allows previously an employee, officer employee of a municipality mentioned in the letter's patent was prevented from being appointed to the board. And now there's an attempt with this particular motion to allow them to be appointed if they're not found to be in a conflict of interest. I think I'm not sure who this is for or why this is being proposed. I think there are plenty of candidates that could be appointed that do not, through their employment, have a kind of a built-in conflict of interest. You're an employee of, let's say, the District of North Vancouver, and you're on the board of the Port of Vancouver. You're paid by one. You're supposed to act in the interest of the other. I don't know how you can separate out and choose which issues are raised result in a conflict of interest. So it's cleaner to have it removed, to not include this new provision to allow municipal and legislative or members of the legislature, et cetera, to be able to get around this provision. So we think it's a clause that actually creates more conflicts of interest as opposed to removing them. So I don't know why it's in there. We couldn't really get an answer to that, but it seems to me it's creating more conflicts of interest than it is preventing. So we just think the clause should be negatived.
Thank you, Mr. Straw. I'll turn it over to Mr. Backrack.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I believe this is the clause that speaks to both municipal employees and provincial employees. Is that correct? I see Mr. Straw nodding, and representing a region where we have very significant ports surrounded by very small communities or smaller municipalities. It's a situation in which a considerable portion of the population either works for the provincial government or for the municipal government. And when you're looking for qualified board members that are able to make that contribution and have the background and the professionalism required for such a position, it's not a huge pool when it comes to local voices for those roles. And I think that might be the spirit in which this clause was brought forward by the government, that they want to ensure that people aren't prevented from filling those roles in their home community when no conflict exists. And I've looked through some of the conflict of interest provisions that are part of the letters patent, and they're fairly strong. And we had this conversation when it came to the appointment of labor representatives on ports and looking at what stipulations already exist to prevent conflicts of interest. So, if you're a provincial employee and you work for a ministry that has no association with port activities or the marine transportation sector, I guess I just feel like that shouldn't be a disqualifying characteristic. And I would hope that I think Mr. Strahl raises the important question where conflicts clearly exist. We don't want people to be put in those positions, but it seems like right now the rules cast that net too broadly and prevent a significant number of people from filling those vacancies.
Thank you, Mr. Straw. Any other questions? Yes, Mr. Badaway.
I agree with Mr. Backrack. This gives an opportunity for qualified local candidates to be part of the process. And frankly, if in fact they have a conflict of interest, they'll be under the same rules that anyone else would be under. So I would agree wholeheartedly with what Mr. Backrack said.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. Yes, Mr. Straw.
I guess I'd ask the witnesses. This is clear. This is a new provision that previously they were just excluded. It was not possible. It was deemed that those were inherently conflicting positions to be working for another level of government and then getting onto a port board. So is there a specific case? Is this, as Mr. Backrack says, simply a matter of expanding the qualified pool of, I would assume in Mr., up near the Port of Prince Rupert, there are many qualified candidates and not all of them work for the government or different levels of government. So I guess what is the impetus for this change, and why is it necessary to include new provisions that allow for those employees that were previously considered ineligible because of an inherent conflict? Why is this being done?
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. I could turn it over to our witnesses, perhaps, for a response to that. Ms. Reid.
So in the context of the port's modernization review, this was one of the issues that was raised, particularly in respect of ports that were located around smaller communities. And it's the reason why that provision is being introduced, and also the complementary position in respect of the provincial employees as well. So in both cases, it was really about expanding the pool of available potential board of directors or people that could be appointed, recognizing that there are substantive provisions both in the letters patent in terms of how to manage conflict of interest, and understanding that by virtue of the fact that they are a municipal employee or potentially a provincial employee, that can be a very broad net, that it's not necessarily inherent that they have a real conflict of interest based on their duties in respect of that employment.
Thank you, Ms. Reed. Mr. Strahl?
And so what do the letters patent currently say? Who is the arbiter of those conflicts of interest, and how are they who determines who holds a conflict of interest, and what is the process for perhaps a complaint or a concern being raised by either the board or a user, someone in the port system? How do they raise concerns if the board director, who's now an employee of either provincial or municipal level of government, does not believe they're in a conflict, but someone else believes they are? Who's the arbiter of that, and what does that process look like?
Ms. Kaufman? Ms. Moriarty?
Hi, thanks. What I could point to is the Canada Marine Act, Section 22(1), actually outlines duty of care as it relates to directors and officers. And really in there, it talks about the fact that they have a vested interest to ensure that they act honestly in good faith. So it does speak to the concerns that you're raising here in respect of conflict of interest. So that's in the Canada Marine Act. As well, there are elements that are contained in the letters patent. If there are issues, so that is there, but as well as before there are appointments, there are vetting procedures that take place within the government system. And then if there are any issues that are flagged, during that tenure, it's my understanding that those are investigated, but I'd have to get back to you on the exact process by which that happens. I don't have it at my fingertips, but what I can say is there is a requirement in the law that any officer of the port, as it relates to being a board director or other, ensure that they adhere to a certain protocol. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Moriarty. I'm going to turn it back over to Mr. Strahl.
So are there cases where, even currently, where a board member, prior to appointment or as a condition of appointment, has, we see it here in government as well, that there's a preset ethics screen? There's certain ministers that can't talk about Irving, because of their relationship with them, etc. I'm not saying this is how the system is supposed to work, but does that system exist where you say you're a qualified person, but you cannot, if this type of issue comes up, you must recuse yourself? Or is that on the good faith of the board member to self-select in that regard?
Yes, thank you. I actually don't have the answer to that question with me here now. I'll have to circle back.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
So we get a response. Did you want to also?
Yeah, well, sure, if we're willing to do that.
Yes, Ms. Murray.
Well, I just wanted to comment that I think that the idea of a particular screen may be a good solution, because otherwise what's happening here is the conservative amendments are in cross purposes. Like, on the one hand, there's a desire to make sure that appointments happen more quickly, knowing that there sometimes is a pool that's not inexhaustible, and that there are parameters around inclusion and competence and so on. But on the other hand, the conversation here could be seeking to reduce the pool. And my thought is that there are many provincial officials who have nothing to do with the port, but may have to do with supply chain, or may have to do with safety and security standards for the health, the long-term care system, or something very unrelated to what could create a conflict of interest, but has a basic experience and competency that would make them an excellent board member. So I just wanted to make that observation. It's not all port people that we're talking about, in the provincial government or in municipal government.
Seeing no other Questions, comments, or concerns? We will go to a vote on clause 104. What's that? As it stands, yeah. No, so stands, yeah.
Mr. Butterway,
Yes.
Monsieur Iacono,
Oui.
Madame Koutrakis,
Yes. Yes.
Mr. Rogers,
Yes.
Mr. Stroll,
No.
Mr. Muse,
No.
Dr. Lewis,
No.
Mr. Lewis,
No.
Monsieur Bersalou Duval,
Oui.
Yes.
In favor.
7 yeas, 4 nays.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Clause 104 carried. Clause 105, et pour ça, on va passer la parole à Monsieur Barcelou Duval.
And for that, we'll turn it over to Mr. Barcelou Duval.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Donc, en fait,
So, the amendment, Block 4, which reads as follows. You all have the text with you. So instead of reading it out, I may just explain the objective and what exactly this amendment seeks to achieve. More specifically, the amendment comes when you look at section 105. It suppresses or deletes. I propose to delete paragraph 17 completely because 17.1 we can strike out in the French. We can strike out the last part which says without the minister's approval. I think everyone around the table is aware of the witness accounts that we received around the table, especially with regard to the appointment of the chairperson of the board, and a number of concerns were raised by virtually all the witnesses that we listened to. I don't think there's anybody who would like to have a perception that the person appointed to this position is appointed for political reasons, or the person is an instrument at the hands of government or the current ruling party. They all seemed to mention that the current process is preferable than what is proposed in Bill C-33. That is why we're submitting this amendment. There's equally the possibility of striking out 17.1 because we realized that with regard to interim positions and the appointment of a chairperson, this was not included in the current bill, the current maritime bill, and the idea is to take out the last section which says the last words which have to do with the authorization of the minister, and to allow for the possibility to operate with interim chairpersons given the circumstances. Thank you, Mr. Duval. Any questions and comments, Mr. Stroll?
I have one question for Mr. Barcelou Duval and one for the witnesses. The first, just to be clear, does this amendment? I know it takes out without the minister's approval from 17.1, but is the intention? I heard you say to delete 17 in its entirety. So this would preserve 17.1, but would delete 17, which is the minister's authority to appoint the chairperson. Is that correct?
C'est exactement votre interprétation, c'est ça.
That is exactly, your interpretation is accurate.
I think ours is very similar to that. Then to the witnesses here, we're talking about, obviously, if the chair is incapacitated or removed, then the vice chair is incapacitated or removed. So we're talking about a fairly uncommon occurrence here. I think for 17.1, we're down to the third in command acting as the chair. What is the current process in legislation for a board of directors at a port if both the chair or the vice chair and the vice chair, I should say, the chair and the vice chair are unable to act.
Ms. Reed?
So currently, the legislation is silent on that. So 17.1 was to address the scenario that if that happened, what would be the process? Because there is no provision right now.
Has it happened in the past? Is this something that has happened that requires a legislative amendment, or is it a looking ahead, what if type of provision? Do you know of any examples of where both the board chair and vice chair have been unable to act?
I'm not aware of any specific examples. So it is looking ahead, but we can go back and see if there's anything specific that has happened previously. But it was identified as a gap in the context of our review of the legislation.
Is this only an issue because the minister in 17 is given the authority to appoint that chair? Because if the board was just operating without the minister having the power over the chair, I assume they would vote and simply have an acting chair as a resolution of the board. But because the minister has given himself the authority in 17, that's not possible. Is that why this is necessary at all? Is because of the minister now appoints the board chair?
I think that would be part of it. So currently, it is the board that appoints the chair under the existing Section 17 of the Act. So if the minister is responsible for appointing the chair, it would be necessary to have a provision to allow the board to appoint on an interim basis a chair to ensure that there is no gap.
Right. So I guess my point being, it would be my understanding, and again, I would seek clarification from legislative council, if the entire clause 105 is deleted, what would happen would be the status quo, which would be that the board appoints their own chair from amongst its members that have been appointed by the minister and others, and that in the event of an incapacity of both the chair and the vice chair, the board would simply exercise its authority to appoint another chair. So this provision 17.1 is only necessary if the minister is given the power to appoint the board chair, which we don't think the minister should have. So I understand what Mr. Barcelou-Duval is doing. He wants to put some limits on the minister's power there, but I think the best way to actually limit the minister's power and allow the board to operate at arm's length is to simply delete the entirety of clause 105, which would then take away the minister's power to appoint the board chair and would also give the board back the power to act in the best interest of the board in the case of an incapacity of both the chair and the vice chair. So I think if it's as good as we can get, we'd support that. But I think deleting the entire clause actually achieves better the status quo where the board is given back control of their operations without the minister's interference in the board chair selection process.
Thank you, Mr. Straw. I'll turn it over to Mr. Bachrach, followed by suivi par Mr. Barcelou-Duval. Mr. Bachrach.
I think I had the same question, which is that if we just scrap this clause from the bill, we go back to the status quo, which seemed to be working in terms of chair selection. And perhaps my question, so that's my first question, is that indeed the case? And I think that might be the same question Mr. Straw was just asking.
Just for clarification, what's the question, just for the legislative clerks?
If we were to vote down this clause, we would go back to the status quo that existed with regards to the selection of a chair, whereby boards, the Port Authority boards themselves selected a chair from within their ranks. And if the chair and the vice chair positions became vacant, they would simply reiterate that process and select another member from their ranks to serve as chair. That seemed to be working. The challenge I have here is that we didn't hear any testimony that really supported this clause in the bill. And perhaps the witnesses could, we've referenced the port modernization review before. I'm curious if there were any participants in that review that called for this specific change to require that, or to empower the minister to appoint the chair of Port Authority boards, because certainly in our witness testimony that we heard before the committee, There were several witnesses that came forward and said they didn't like this idea, but we didn't hear any that really supported the government's direction on this. So I'm curious if there's been any supporting testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. I'm going to turn it over to the witnesses to first confirm the question that you had, if anybody wants to comment on that.
Just to clarify, Mr. Chair, the question regarding whether or not 17.1 is necessary if 17 is removed, is that the question?
Correct.
So, so 17.1 would not be necessary if 17 is removed, is my understanding.
Okay. Then with regards to witness testimony, reiterating the importance or the need or in favor of providing the government with.
Could I clarify?
Yeah, go ahead.
It was more like we heard the witness testimony, so I'm not expecting the officials to characterize it. It was more around the port modernization review and whether this was one of the recommendations coming out of the consultations with stakeholders in that process.
Ms. Reid?
It was not raised by external stakeholders.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Basse-Duval.
Ben, peut-être simplement en terminant.
So, just in conclusion, on this same point, I'm going to lower my hand. Thank you. So, obviously, the amendment which is tabled, which was tabled by the clerk to achieve the objective which we had to reduce the power of nomination from of the chairperson from the minister's hands. As far as I'm concerned, I'll simply go with the committee's will, and whether my amendment or that of the Conservatives is adopted, which consists in either completely striking out 17.1 or 17, to me brings us to the same result. And because as far as 17.1 is concerned, I think striking it off simply formalizes the process that leads to the appointment of an interim chairperson without requiring any consultation from the minister, even if this appointment goes beyond 90 days. And I think in one scenario or the other would achieve the same results. Hence, the reason why I will vote in favor of my own amendment. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Barcelot-Duval.
I think in the same vein as what I think I heard Mr. Barcelot-Duval say, I would be happy to withdraw CPC 5 if knowing that negativing section 105 would achieve the same result. So I would, knowing what we've heard now, that we don't need to, ours kind of partitions, saves one and not the other. Deleting the entire clause actually achieves both things, which is to remove the minister's power to select the chair, which we heard again and again was not in the best interest of the port, and makes this chairperson's absence or incapacity in 17.1 unnecessary. So that would be upcoming. We would simply, having heard what we've heard from the witnesses, believe that the best thing that we can do is actually delete this clause in its entirety.
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. Yes, Ms. Murray.
I just do want to introduce the perspective of why having the power to appoint the chair may be considered in the first place. As someone who is a Vancouverite, and we have the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority with basically most of the municipalities in Greater Vancouver being ones that has some aspect of the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority. MP Strahl just said that having the board appoint the chair having the minister appoint the chair is not in the best interest of the port, and I can appreciate that. However, there are communities all interwoven and around the elements of the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority that have very strong community perspectives, and it may be about It may be about conservation of a certain area that the port would like to have as a gravel dump reserve, or it may be about development that are not in line with the local communities. And my experience and those that I've heard from other caucus members is that there is a sense of powerlessness amongst the municipalities that the port can overrule and override their interests. So if there is some way to, we may make a decision as a committee to remove the power to name a chair, but is there a way that we can reflect that the communities in which the ports are embedded and the ports with noise, light, development, etc., emissions and so on, as well as development of sensitive lands, that those do affect municipalities that don't necessarily have much of a say in the board. So it's not that this was put in absent of having a rationale to make some improvements for the larger good. It was about addressing an issue that I won't speak for other ports, but certainly Vancouver Fraser Port, that is something that we've heard as caucus members from our municipalities.
Murray, Mr. Strahl.
Just to that point, and again, I know that this testimony has happened over time, and Ms. Murray has joined us recently, which is great. But I think there are other provisions in the bill that members can point to show, an increased community engagement. Some of them I think are a little onerous in some situations and for some ports, but there are the advisory committees, there are things like that. And just to be clear, these appointments are the majority of the appointments are made by a minister. So if the minister needs to do a better job of appointing people that are more responsive to local needs, that discussion can happen. But the issue, we heard it again and again and again, is that by appointing the chair from amongst that group, when the minister appoints the chair, it adds a layer of politicization that is unhelpful and starts to cloud the arm's length nature of that board. We heard it from every witness who was asked had a concern about this. So I think to Ms. Murray's point, courts can be responsive in other ways, but using this as saying that the chairperson being appointed by the minister somehow is going to provide greater accountability to local municipalities, we didn't hear that. In fact, we heard testimony to the contrary. So I just think I have rarely seen such a unanimous condemnation of a clause, and the minister himself said there was no reason, there had been no case where the board was acting in opposition to the government, and that but it could happen in the future. So I think we definitely need to delete this clause, and if there's problems with the community consultation elsewhere, they can be addressed elsewhere, but not in this clause.
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. Mr. Badaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I as well see this and seen this as a challenge. I think for the most part, as Mr. Strahl and others have mentioned, the minister does in fact appoint the board, and with that, good people, appropriate people, and with that, there's no reason why they can't pick amongst each other in terms of a chairperson. So we will be supporting Mr. Barcelo-Duval's motion or sub-amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. Seeing no other questions or comments, we'll go to a vote on Block 4.
Mr. Baraway,
Yes.
Monsieur Iacono,
Yes.
Madame Koutrakis,
Oui.
Ms. Murray,
Oui.
Mr. Rogers,
Yes.
Mr. Strahl,
No.
Mr. Muse,
No.
Dr. Lewis,
No.
Mr. Lewis,
No.
Monsieur Barsalou-Duval,
Oui.
Mr. Backrack. 6 yeas, 5 nays.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Block 4 carries, which makes CPC 5 moot. We will now go, well, I guess, shall clause 105 carry as amended?
So I think we can now discuss the amended motion. Is that not how this works?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So
Over to you, Mr. Strahl.
I think I appreciate the spirit in which the amendment was moved and has just been passed. I still think we should actually, having heard what we heard today, defeat the amended motion, the amended section, because now the minister is now inserted into the process if there is an acting so that there's without the minister's approval is removed. I just think it's unnecessary now. If we've taken out 17, then this is and we've taken out with am I correct that the block motion also took out without the minister's approval? Yeah, so 17's gone, without the minister's approval is gone. It kind of preserves the status quo now, does it not? Like, what does 17.1 do as amended that that is different than what is in current legislation?
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. I'll turn it over to our witnesses to respond to that. Ms. Reed.
As I understand it, it would provide probably better clarification for the process. It would still provide clarification for a process. However, my understanding based on conversation is that it is not necessary that the board in the current status would appoint a new chair in the event there was a vacancy under the current process.
But now that the minister is no longer appointing the board chair, which we just have voted in favor of, why are we limiting the board's ability to appoint a chairperson for no more? Why are we saying 90 days now? Why have we now limited what a board can do to a 90-day period? Because then it will simply go back to the board to what? Like, this seems to be a 90-day recurring cycle at that point. How could the board appoint a permanent replacement without having this 90? It would be a 90-day terms one after the other if 17.1 remains. I stand to be corrected. That's my reading of it. Is that if the board is back to selecting its own chair, how does the 90-day limit not make these short-term 3-month appointments in perpetuity?
Ms. Reed or Ms. Heft?
If there's an absence or incapacity of both the chairperson and the vice chair, which could be on a temporary basis, this could allow for a temporary replacement. Until there's a resignation. Or
Okay,
the chair or vice chair is removed for incapacity.
If there's a vacancy in the office, it says in there, if there's in the event of an absence or incapacity of the chairperson or a vacancy in that office. So I'm really not trying to be difficult here. I do read that as saying if something happens to the board chair, does this allow the board to impose a permanent solution as they would now that 17 is gone? They don't need the minister's authority anymore. So that's my only question is that 90-day provision seems to me to prevent a board of directors from permanently replacing a board chair or permanently having a vice chair act. I stand to be corrected. I can leave it, but it seems to me it causes more confusion than is worth the clause. So
I'll turn it back over to Ms. Heft or Ms. Reed, and then I'll turn it over to Mr. Bassel-Duval, followed by Mr. Backrack. Ms. Heft.
Under the current system, they can continue to appoint if there's a vacancy, a full vacancy. If it's a temporary incapacity, they could use this clause for a simple temporary double incapacity 90-day window, should that event ever occur.
I've said what I can say.
Thank you, Ms. Heft. Mr. Barcel-Duval, suivi par Mr. Bachrach.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. En
Thank you,
fait,
Mr. Chair. I think what my conservative colleague does not understand is that Section 17 of the Maritime Act in Canada continues to exist. The same way it continues to exist, it doesn't force the board members to appoint in perpetuity members. It just allows them to appoint someone on an interim basis for 90 days. And Section 17 mentions clearly that the board of directors would appoint someone from among the board members to be there for. So I think it simply puts in place a possible or potential process in order to designate an interim chairperson for the board.
I think I'm on the same page as Mr. Strahl, which is that under the current process, I'm unclear what the gap is that exists in the under current law, because members of the board choose a chair from among their ranks. I would assume that if someone is temporarily incapacitated, the board could pass a resolution temporarily appointing someone else as the chair. Is there anything to preclude that? Or vice chair or third vice president or whatever the position may be? Like it seems like that under current law, the board is the master of its destiny when it comes to its chair, and there should be nothing to prevent it from either temporarily or permanently appointing a new chair when it needs to. And so I guess the question is, where does the gap exist under current law, and why are we entertaining the proposal?
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Ms. Heft.
As unusual as the situation is, we believe that the boards are currently resolving it themselves if it does come up. So through their resolutions, they must have some form of process, but we don't regulate it.
Thank you, Ms. Heft. Seeing no any questions or comments, we'll go to a vote on Clause 105 as amended.
Mr. Butterway? Yes. Monsieur Iacono?
Yes.
Madame Koutrakis?
Oui.
Ms. Murray?
Oui.
Mr. Rogers?
Yes.
Mr. Strahl?
No.
Mr. Muse?
No.
Dr. Lewis?
No.
Mr. Lewis?
No.
Monsieur Barcel-Duval?
oui.
Mr. Bachrach?
No.
6 yeas, 5 nays.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Clause 105 as amended carries. Shall Clause 106 carry, colleagues? We'll go to vote on division. 106 carried on division. We'll now go to Clause 107. For that, I'll turn the floor over to you, Mr. Strahl, to address CPC 6.
This is an attempt to recognize the capacity, and I know there'll be some other amendments that have been proposed, I think, that are trying to do the same thing. But we heard again and again about the different capacities that exist in the port authorities in this country based on their size, the number of employees, the revenues, etc. So what this amendment attempts to do is to leave the kind of the general direction, which states that for the purposes of this part, the governor and council may make regulations respecting the impact of the operation of a port by a port authority on the environment, including climate change, and the impact of climate change on the operation of a port. And it stops there and doesn't go into the prescriptive 6 individual things that a port authority needs to do. It's less prescriptive and more general in nature, allows for some flexibility on the part of the cabinet to direct ports on what they must do and what they must report when it comes to the environment and climate change. So it takes it takes away the prescriptive nature and leaves it as more general, which I think will have it'll be more palatable for the smaller ports that don't have the capacity or dealing with 4 or 5 employees. I think trying to do all of this reporting would be very, very onerous for some of the smaller ports. Obviously, for the bigger ports, they're already doing this in large part. But that was the attempt of the amendment, is to make it less prescriptive.
Thank you, Mr. Stroll. Just a quick note, colleagues, if CPC 6 is adopted, NDP 10 cannot be moved due to a line conflict. So I want to help guide our discussions on that. Mr. Badaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First off, I'd like to hear from our witnesses on their thoughts on this clause.
Ms. Reid?
So the intention of this clause is to support broader decarbonization efforts in respect of the marine sector as part of the overall plan regarding climate change mitigation and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions through the marine sector, including in the port sector. And it's providing additional details through regulation in respect of the expectations of ports and the role that they play also as hubs, intermodal hubs, across the kind of the range of activities.
Thank you, Ms. Reid. Mr. Badaway?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, this section of the bill makes it very clear that what authorities the government has to make regulations on environmental obligations of ports, and I'll even extend it not only with ports, but also with port partners, whether it be any method of transportation. This includes the ability to set emission targets, the contents of climate change reports on a regular basis, timelines, as well as the requirements for public participation in the development of these plans. Mr. Chairman, this is sort of near and dear to my heart because we've worked quite hard in our part of the world, in Niagara, alongside our partners, for example, with the Hamilton Oshawa Port Authority, with the marine industry that do ply the Great Lakes. I know, for example, the marine industry that does ply the Great Lakes have Green Marine Matters, and really have taken on an initiative in partnership with the federal government, which is what this does. With that, along the Welland Canal area, and of course into the Hamilton area as well, we take very serious the partnership that we have with the federal government when it comes to setting those emission targets and really abiding by the environmental concerns that we all recognize, at least most of us recognize here in the country. So I can't support this sub-amendment simply because it takes away that partnership and that ability that we otherwise have with our partners, not only within marine, within ports, but also in the bigger picture with respect to the inter and multimodal hubs that we've created and that we're actually strengthening. And quite frankly, Mr. Chairman, I want to add to that is not only are they being strengthened because of the obvious economic reasons, but they're also being strengthened with the environmental responsibilities and stewardship they've taken on, once again, in partnership with the federal government.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. Seeing no other questions or comments, we'll go to the question. Shall CPC 6 carry?
Mr. Badaway?
No.
Monsieur Iacono?
No.
Madame Koutrakis?
No.
Ms. Murray?
No.
Mr. Rogers?
No.
Mr. Stroll?
Yes.
Mr. Muse?
Yes.
Dr. Lewis?
Yes.
Mr. Lewis?
Yes.
Monsieur Bersalou Duval?
No.
Mr. Backrack?
No.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
CPC 6 does not carry. We'll now go to NDP 10, and for that, I'll turn the floor over to you, Mr. Backrack.
Chair. Okay, so NDP 10. This amends lines 13 to 15 on page 70, and the proposed amended text reads, establishing absolute greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets in respect of the operation of a port by a port authority that are consistent with Canada's international commitments and with the national greenhouse gas emissions targets for each milestone year under the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. So the idea here is to try to align what we're requiring of port authorities with what the government is doing more broadly. And the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act lays out a timeline for reporting and planning. And I think it makes a lot of sense that when we're requiring other entities to engage in this planning and reporting exercise, that the timelines align so that the lessons that we learn through, for instance, the Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development, the reports that that person tables can be integrated into all of these other plans that we're talking about. So hopefully that's clear enough, and I'll leave my comments at that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach. Yes, Mr. Strahl.
I guess my question is absolute greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. We heard some questions in question period about obviously caps and things like that today. Are we getting ahead of where the government is on other pieces of legislation, or is this matching? I guess there's obviously been some questions about how that should be done, but without getting into the commentary, just where are things at? Is this an alignment, or is this pushing ahead of where the government is now, hoping they catch up on the rest of their with the rest of their absolute greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets? So maybe Taylor could answer that for me.
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. Mr. Bachrach.
My hope is that it would be consistent with what we're pushing the government to do nationally. Our federal greenhouse gas commitments are specify absolute reductions as opposed to relative reductions, and so I think that it only makes sense that we require the same when specifying other climate plans and other targets of other entities. There are gains to be made through efficiencies, of course, but really what we're talking about as a country is reducing the absolute amount in tons of greenhouse gases that we're putting into the atmosphere. And other objectives, so economic growth, population growth, etc., have to fall within that constraint. That really what we're talking about is that over time, our emissions need to go down. And that's not only applicable to us as a country, but it's applicable to the entire planet. We're talking about absolute emissions reductions as opposed to intensity-based or relative emissions reductions. So that's the intention there. I hope that helps clarify.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Seeing no other questions or comments, we'll go to vote on NDP 10. Turn it over to you, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Badaway,
Yes.
Mr. Iacono,
Oui. Oui.
Madame Koutrakis,
Oui.
Ms. Murray,
Oui.
Mr. Rogers,
Yes.
Mr. Strahl,
No.
Mr. Muse,
No.
Dr. Lewis,
No.
Mr. Lewis,
No.
Monsieur Barsalou Duval,
Oui.
Mr. Bachrach,
Yes.
7 yeas, 4 nays.
Thank you very much, Madam Clerk. NDP 10 carries. We'll now go to new NDP 11, and for that, I'll turn it over to you once again, Mr. Bachrach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this amendment would require the environment and climate change regulations in the amendment we just passed to be implemented within 36 months of the letter's patent. Otherwise, the minister would be required to create a report to explain the reason for the delay and to do so within 12 months. So I could read out the exact wording, but well, why not, right? It's with your indulgence. If no regulations are made for the purposes of each of paragraphs 1.1a to f for an existing port authority within 36 months after the day on which this section comes into force, or for a new port authority within 36 months after the day on which its letters patent are issued, the minister must cause a report stating the reasons that no regulations have been made and establishing a schedule for making regulations to be laid before each House of Parliament on any of the first 10 days on which that House is sitting after the expiry of that 36-month period. And further, 1.3, if no regulations are made within 12 months after the tabling of the report referred to in subsection 1.2, the minister must cause a report stating the reasons that no regulations have been made and establishing a schedule for making regulations to be laid before each House of Parliament on any of the first 10 days on which that House is sitting after the expiry of that 12-month period, and at least once every subsequent 12-month period, as long as no regulations have been made. So this is an accountability measure. It's to serve as a backstop in the case that no regulations are made within the stipulated time frame, and I think otherwise it should be fairly self-explanatory.
Thank you, Mr. Backrack.
If somewhat lengthy.
Seeing no questions or comments, we'll go to a vote on NDP 11.
Mr. Beraway,
Yes.
Monsieur Iacono,
Yes.
Madame Koutrakis,
Oui.
Ms. Murray,
Yes.
Mr. Rogers,
Yes.
Mr. Stroll,
No.
Mr. Muse,
No.
Dr. Lewis,
No.
Mr. Lewis,
No.
Monsieur Barsalou Duval,
Oui.
Mr. Backrack,
Yes.
7 yeas, 4 nays.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. NDP 11 carries. We'll now go to clause 107 as amended, colleagues. Over to you, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Beraway,
Yes.
Monsieur Iacono,
Yes.
Madame Koutrakis,
Oui.
Ms. Murray,
Yes.
Mr. Rogers,
Yes.
Mr. Stroll, Mr. Muse,
No.
Dr. Lewis,
No.
Mr. Lewis,
No.
Monsieur Barsalou Duval,
Oui.
Mr. Backrack,
Yes.
7 yeas, 4 nays.
Thank you very much, Madam Clerk. Clause 107 as amended carries. We'll now go to clause 108 and block 4.1. Et pour ça, je vous passe la parole, Monsieur Barcelou Duval.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Alors,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe many committee members would be familiar with what I'm going to say because during our last meeting, we talked about this and I mentioned that the main amendment was the BQ 4.1 amendment, and here we are. And essentially, this amendment aims at ensuring that ports are able to collaborate together. They can do joint ventures together and carry out a number of activities together. And this offers more flexibility and takes out that obligation to compete against one another, compete with one another, and rather work hand in gloves. And I think we're going to be able to leverage our supply chains and better serve the users. So that's my argument as far as 4.1 is concerned. I hope everyone will support this.
Turn it over to Mr. Badaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do like the intent of this motion. It's actually something that we're working on with many port authorities currently. Quite frankly, even more than a port authority, as I was saying earlier, more of in a multimodal, so rail, water, road, and air. However, I think we just need to see, I guess, the thoughts first of all from the department or from the witnesses. So if I can hear that first, and then I have some comments to make, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. I'll turn it over to you, Ms. Reid.
So with respect to the proposed amendment, I think the key concern from a departmental perspective in respect of the existing legislation would be understanding whether or not the joint entity would actually be acting as an agent of the Crown, because I believe the previous amendment 3.1, which would have limited agency, was not accepted by the committee, was not adopted by the committee. And so some of the provisions in terms of the existing restrictions, I think, around collaboration in ports are focused on ensuring that the risk to the Crown is managed and that the nature of the collaboration does not place undue risk on one port authority or another in a way that ensures their continued financial self-sustainability. So those would be, I think, the key considerations from a departmental perspective.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Reid. Mr. Chair, all of a port's allowable activities are governed by its letters patent. If you look at this section in the Canada Marine Act, you'll see that subsections 2A and 2B both reference the letters patent. And if we're proposing to create a new class of allowable port activities like joint ventures, I think they should also be specified in the letters patent, as are all other activities. This would help us be consistent and to make sure, Mr. Chairman, there is appropriate oversight of these new entities. And I know that the members' previous related amendments all made reference to the letters patent. So I'd like to propose, Mr. Chairman, a sub-amendment, if it's in order, that inserts that language just to be consistent.
Okay. Could you specify, Mr. Badaway, what language and where?
Okay, so I'll read the sub-amendment.
Yes, please.
And it'll articulate all that.
Thank you.
So 1.1, Section 28 of the Act is amended by adding the following after subsection 2. 2.1, therefore, to the extent authorized in each participating Port Authority's letters patent, 2 or more Port Authorities may jointly, through a corporation, partnership, joint venture, association, or other entity whose shares or other ownership interests are all held by Port Authorities, engage in the activities referred to in subsection 2.
Can you send that to the clerk, please? Thank you, Mr. Badaway. Questions, comments on Mr. Badaway's sub-amendment? Oui, Monsieur Barcel-Duval.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, of course, I didn't see in writing what is proposed by Mr. Badaway, but I'd like to get it. But from what I understand, essentially is in order to is based on the fact that during the last session we adopted the proposal BQ 3.2, which allowed government to amend the letters pattern to allow them to conduct activities jointly. So 4.1 allows these port authorities to conduct activities together. So from what I understand, we would like to add the aspect that in order to be able to avail themselves of this, the letters patent need to have been amended before then. And from what I understand, that's what we did in block 3.2, which we adopted. But of course, if it's government's will to add this in order to be certain that it is clear everywhere and that there's no section that could, or paragraph that could be viewed or interpreted in contradiction. Of course, I'd like to see the text of the bill. Now, with regard to the fact that BQ 3.1 was not adopted, the thing that I'm reassured about is the fact that in spite of this, there is BQ 3.2, which was adopted, and government needs to adopt operations. And before a port authority conducts activities, they need to ask government to amend their patent, letters patent, and then government can be able to keep a certain amount of control and oversight and exercise oversight. And if there's a desire to add another aspect to the letters patent, there's still the possibility to bring back BQ 3.1, which I would have loved us to adopt in the first place. Thank you, Mr. Barcelat Duval.
This meeting is suspended until such time as we have translation for the sub-amendment proposed by Mr. Badaway. Thank you, colleagues. Order. Yes. Colleagues, we will have translation, but most likely not have time to debate. So what we will do is we will adjourn for today. And if it's the pleasure of the committee, we will see you all back here on Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. Seeing no objection, meeting is adjourned. Bonne soirée tout le monde.